Welcome to a Sweet Savor Bible School. Thank you for watching. My name is James Reinarz, and this is a clip from a Zoom class I taught recently on the history of Christian hymns, with a focus on singing devotionally. There were several parts to the class, but these clips are just of the lecture portion. More information can be found in the description.
Okay, so we are on the second half of the life of Margaret E. Barber. One slogan that I think we'll see very much followed her throughout her life is, I want nothing for myself. I want everything for the Lord. We'll see she really chose a simple and a hard life that just provided very little, creature comforts for her. And then very little acclaim in her life, but a lot of clear fruit for us to think about afterwards. So just to review from last class, M.E. Barber was an English missionary sent to China, Fuzhou, China, by the Church Missionary Society, 1896, from 96 to 1907. So just a little over a decade. And this period really was just a great season, sowing valuable experience into her life of preaching the gospel, traveling between villages, working with all different kinds of people, teaching the Bible in classes, and dealing with people's real problems, real questions, real challenges to faith, all in a foreign language. So just so many experiences laid a base that we see come out more in her second period. And at the end of that 1905-1906 period, she resigns for just a combination of several reasons. We saw a little bit how there was something of a proposed new regulation changed in the authority structure of the mission, and she was leading the charge in being outspoken about that, though definitely not alone. There was also somewhat separate, maybe hand in hand with her outspokenness, she had some falling out of favor with the senior teachers at her school. At the same time, her health also broke down. Well, she had many health breakdowns over this decade, but when she returned to England, it was technically on a health certificate. The doctor said, you cannot stay. And then, there's definitely maybe a little bit of politics in that. One of the private notes to the Home Secretary said, for her sake and for that of the mission, I think she should go home. They're English. They don't make too many comments, but that for that of the mission probably says a lot. So technically her health breaking down is what sent her back to England. But she was also, there's evidence that she was being kind of challenged by the word and by the Lord regarding some of the Anglican Church's teaching, especially infant baptism. Now she is back home. Her family is in Norwich. She grew up, in her teens in Norwich. And she somehow, we don't quite know when, becomes in contact with a church called Surrey Chapel. And she becomes very connected, very affected by what is going on there. Now, Surrey Chapel is a free church. We're a nonconformist. They're not part of the Anglican system. And those are very clear lines at that time. Today, in the Christian world, people don't even really think about, is this a Baptist or a Presbyterian? They can all look the same sometimes, right? This is a different era where being in a nonconformist building really meant you're making a choice. But in that, she also made a decision to be rebaptized as an adult by immersion, not sprinkled as an infant. And this is a real clear just challenge and change, and really solidifies her break with the Anglican system. You see in her letter, this is her resignation letter to her secretary. God has clearly and distinctly guided me to join an undenominational church in Norwich. That was what they called it, an undenominational church in Norwich, whose pastor is Mr. D.M. Panton, a man I rank next to Dr. Pearson in his exposition of the Word of God. This letter, I have a couple of dates. We can see some connection and flow here. This letter was written September of 1907. This is when she formally resigns. November 3rd, we know that she is received into membership at Surrey Chapel. And by November 11th, I found a letter that is clear that already in China, that news of her rebaptism was already there. Somebody had written back regarding hearing about M.E. Barber's rebaptism. So it takes about 5 to 6 weeks for letters to go from England to China, and then another 5 to 6 weeks to go back. So she likely was baptized several months before this point, maybe around the time of her resignation. And interestingly enough, so this is November 11th, 1907. In December, the end of that month, 2 other women missionaries resigned from, they are back in China, but in China, they resigned from the CMS, and clearly states in their letters that the teachings of infant baptism were a major factor in their decision, and they intended to become rebaptized. So this just reinforces the idea that there was also some genuinely spiritual challenges to the church's teaching that was going on in her in 1905 that led to her resignation, not just the politics and different things. Okay, so that was all for her. A lot was happening in the context of Surrey Chapel, which has an important history between the teachings of a unique teacher named Robert Govet, whose mantle was picked up around 1900 by David Morrison Panton. And Govet and Panton were both Anglican ministers. I know Govet was, I'm pretty sure David Panton was as well. And again, infant baptism was a real sticking point. When they saw like what Philip, the evangelist, says to the eunuch in Acts, hey, rise and be baptized right now because you're believing. That these kinds of verses really challenged their history and what they had been teaching. And Robert Govet got baptized as an adult, left his collar at back at home somewhere, and took his whole congregation out of the Anglican system. Started something new that eventually became Surrey Chapel. D.M. Panton did the same thing when he was convicted by this in his 20s or 30s. This was just a major thing that God was doing and showing people that believers' baptism was how he intended people to begin their Christian life. But many other teachings were unique to Govet and Panton that would be passed on to Watchman Nee and be part of our heritage today, regarding the kingdom, reward and punishment in the kingdom, separation, not being a denomination, being something just really for the Lord in that kind of way, separate from these kind of divisions. Emmy Barber picked up a lot of these teachings from this short few years at Surrey Chapel. In 1909, there she is on the far left with her niece, Miss Ballard, in the middle. Those two are sent out to China in 1909. Now, there's a Miss Hilda Slap, I believe her name is. I am not clear if she went to Fuzhou as well or was just sent to China at the same time. But Surrey Chapel sent out many missionaries. Okay, so again, she's only back in Norwich from 1907 to 1909. So she has 2 years to reconnect with her family. And Miss Ballard, it seems, may have been at Surrey Chapel before Amy Barber. So that may have been part of the introduction or connection. But Miss Ballard goes along with Miss Barber as her family member, and she's about 20 years younger than Miss Barber. But Miss Barber has a conviction that the Lord wants her back in China. He had called her there to China in the first place. Just because some things went wrong with the mission or changes does not mean that his call on her has changed. I can't find her saying that. I'm just trying to piece together the story a little bit when I say that, because it's not a small thing for someone in midlife to go back to China in this kind of way, and especially without the cushy support of a very large denomination. Surrey Chapel would send out 27 missionaries in these decades, the early 1900s into the 50s, 9 to China in her lifetime. So it's one church supporting a lot of missionaries, but they did not guarantee any money. They guaranteed that they would remember them in prayer regularly, passionately, often, but they would pray for them. And Emmy Barber was 100% on this line of the pattern for the apostles' work in the Bible was a life of faith. And that is what she was sent out with. So yes, a lot of support did come from Surrey Chapel, but there's no contract. There's no monthly stipend. There's none of this, just a guarantee that they will pay. So that's again, why I say it's no small thing for her at the age of 43 to really feel a conviction that God has her back in China. She could easily live out the rest of her. She had a good 10, 11 years of successful ministry. She could easily live out the rest of her life more comfortably back in England, but she's clear to go back. And she could have gone anywhere in China. Actually, the CMS did try to switch her to the Western China mission, so to keep her in their fold. But she goes right back to Fuzhou. That's bold. she knows 15 other missionaries in that field, but she really feels that is her calling. When she returns, some people join her. A Chinese missionary, independent preacher who she must have known, I don't know much more than that, named Li Aiming, joins her. And possibly those same two, Miss Malloy and Sears, may have joined her. It was clear that was their intent and their resignation. I just haven't seen anything yet to say that actually happened or what they did, but they resigned, got rebaptized in China, and intended to join Emmy Barber to begin preaching the gospel in Fuzhou. So really causing a little stir, removing people from the Fujian mission to independently preach the gospel. But with that, she felt these first 2 years were really just the hardest. It's common in a couple places. Here is a quote from the book Anchored to Infinity, which has a lot of her stories from this period of her life. With broken Chinese, Fuzhou dialect, she went into the villages to preach the gospel. She was scolded, sent away by many angry locals. Their tactic of getting rid of foreign barbarians was to send out their fiercest canines. Although Miss Barber was safely kept, she suffered a great deal for the gospel's sake. She also had to endure the persecutions and disdain of other missionaries. One day, she lay lonely in bed with a high fever. She questioned God, did I take the wrong path somewhere? Why then am I in such loneliness, difficulty, and poverty? It was at this time that Miss Barber wrote the following beautiful hymn, Via Bethlehem We Journey. So this is a hymn likely from her early years in this second period, just realizing, yes, the Lord had sent me out, but things aren't going the way I planned. It's hard. I have disdain. I have persecution. I have poverty, and I'm lonely. Even with her coworkers, there just may be a real feeling, did I miss the Lord? Did I follow something wrong? So this is Via Bethlehem We Journey is really one of her most precious hymns. And in her suffering in that time, and the Lord speaking to her, she really sees that the Christian experience is a walking through the path that Jesus trod. His life on earth was not just so he could be here and go to the cross. It was an example at every step of the spiritual pathway. And we see this in her hymn. I have just a couple of lines, but mainly the first lines pulled out of all the verses. But first one, Via Bethlehem we journey. That's where Jesus begins his journey, right? In Bethlehem. We whose hearts on God are set, babe-like souls of Jesus learning. So we're the babe-like souls. We're learning of Jesus while our cheeks with tears are wet. For the manger and the stable are not pleasant to our eyes, not to Jesus's eyes. We're just like babes in the struggle and experience that Jesus had in a manger in a stable. The last lines, but our feet must follow Jesus if our hands would grasp the prize. So she's reflecting on Jesus's experiences, seeing, I'm just like that. I'm a babe. I don't know what's going on. I don't know much, but I know that I'm uncomfortable. My cheeks are wet with tears. The next stage, via Nazareth, that's where he goes next, right? The pathway narrows, still on we go. And then out of Nazareth, eventually he moves up to Capernaum. So via Galilee, we see him. Stones are hurled and curses hissed. He is not well received in Galilee. Verse 4, via to the awful anguish of hours beneath the trees. She follows him to Gethsemane. And then verse 5, then the cross, for via Calvary, every royal soul must go. It's not just Jesus who experiences Calvary. Every royal soul must go. We are a royal priesthood. We're the ones who will follow him in the same path, right? Then the grave, when dear one weeping, and then verse 6. And then 7, on we press and yonder gleaming. And then verse 8, it's beautiful, just a few more miles, beloved, and our feet shall ache no more. I love that line. It's not a Bible verse that I know of, but what a just poetic sentiment of her own experience. Seeing the Lord would almost say something like that in comfort to her. No more sin and no more sorrow. Hush thee, Jesus went before. We could say in many of our sufferings to say, hush, might be a little insensitive, might be not that comforting or caring. And I think this reflects her own experience with the Lord. It's similar to the prophet Jeremiah, when Jeremiah wanted to cry to the Lord about his unreasonable treatment. The Lord said something very challenging to him. The Lord said, if you cannot run with horses, how will you race with men? Something like that, right? Sorry, I got it backwards. If you cannot race with men, contend with men, fight with men, what will you do when it's time to race with horses? I'm paraphrasing, but I know it goes men and then horses next. So God's like, you're complaining about this level 1 suffering. I need a prophet who's ready, who can survive level 2. I'm training you for level 2. So that Jeremiah's word is not that, I'm sorry, let me change things, but like, come on, buddy, we got to get through this. Very similar to a hush thee, Jesus went before. And we may not look forward to that kind of thought, but that is really the path we're on, and that is the view God has in our experience. We can complain about our trials, wish that they were different, but God, with a view to our transformation, not our comfort, might say, hush, hush, Jesus, he also went through this. There's more to come. There's more to come. Hush thee. Jesus went before. So this is just a precious hymn. We will sing 4 verses. It's 8 verses. So after those first 2 years, I don't quite know where she was, but there's one source that says in 1911, she moved to what is known as her home for the rest of her life, Pagoda, Anchorage, or also called White Teeth Rock. Now, she found, when she returned, she didn't really want to step on the toes of her fellow missionaries back in Fuzhou, so she might have traveled in the outskirts for a while. You can see on this map, Fuzhou proper is right here. And actually the new area where a lot of the foreigners developed was on the island called Nantai, which is the kind of new area outside of, at this time, it's outside of Fuzhou. So in this map, this is a current Google Earth's map. This whole thing is Fuzhou city. But at the time, the old city of Fuzhou was all the way up here. And there was some build up on the river here, and then Nantai, where the foreigners were and her schools were, her mission was over here. But eventually, she settled all the way. Pagoda Anchorage is referring to the pagoda that's right here. It's a landmark, but on this side, this is the Anchorage. This is where, I have a little blown up map here, sorry. So the Anchorage, where that means a deeper area where big sailing vessels could get into ports, and they maybe couldn't make it up the river into the city, but they could go here. So it's really just a shipping lane. So this is what became her kind of home. And she actually felt so clear that the Lord had led her to this place. She called this her Canaan, her promised land. And this is where her and Miss Ballard would stay for the next 20 plus years. I actually got to go here with the interns back in, I forget, 2018 probably. This is like a 3 self church or a state church that is on the spot of the village of White Teeth Rock. And they actually are aware of their connection to Emmy Barber. And they actually are kind of like little custodians of us. There's this woman we got to talk to, but they have the book, a lot of the pictures. And then when we saw this book, I was like, oh, these are all the pictures that you see in every book. They're actually in this book in Fuzhou. And, this is just, I really wish that I knew anything about photography when I was here, because now I just have these kind of, the pictures just are what they are. And so I didn't take many pictures, but this shows you a little of the area, very lush. That is, that's some kind of shrine or statue. I don't know how old that is. Maybe it was there when Emmy Barber was there. So this is, there's some things that can be found there in White Teeth Rock. One of the pictures they had was of her rented rooms. She rented 10 rooms that she felt led by the Lord to rent. This is around 1919. So she'd already been there for 8 years, but she felt to kind of expand and rent rooms for hospitality, to take care of traveling workers or missionaries in different ways. It's one of the things that she did in the last decade. This is actually where Watchman Nee stayed when he was really sick. He had many sicknesses in the 1920s, but there's a time where he was writing a section of The Spiritual Man. His old classmate, Faithful Luke, was tending to him, but he was staying in one of these rooms with Emmy Barber and the whole group. And She had many interactions with the Lord regarding this because she felt really led to rent these rooms. She had no stable income, just had to pray for it. And several times the landlord, for various reasons, whether a better business opportunity came up or other things, threatened to evict them. And there's several stories. One is, she heard about it from the landlord, just went back to work. And then Watchman Nee asked her about it a little later, and she said, "The Lord's not playing games with us. He told me to rent these rooms. He didn't do that just to play games with me." So she didn't worry about it. She just went back to work, took her vacation as was planned that year, came back, and the whole problem had cleared up, and she was back to her rooms. Another time, the landlord had made a certain kind of ultimatum, and then you know what? She just knew that wasn't going to change. She wrote the hymn that we have, "Keep Up the Song of Faith," right after that kind of thing. And you know what? She always had these rooms. Every time there was a trial, she just prayed right through it and kept on in faith. Another story with a hymn that we'll also try to sing before our time is up. Again, from just shows a little taste of the struggle that she had to be there. One time, she was sick for 4 days in a row. She had no co-workers with her. Perhaps they were out itinerating. They did a lot of that, planting churches in different places, preaching the gospel. So she had no co-workers with her and no money. And even the cook had gone home. She asked God why she was sick. The Lord showed her clearly that the sickness was not from God, but was an attack from Satan. She told the Lord, "Okay, if I'm wrong, then the sickness will continue. But if it is Satan's attack, then I shall not continue to be sick." And she had already suffered with a high fever for 4 days, but she rose up immediately and wrote a hymn whose first line reads, to the foe, my word is always no. After finishing the hymn, she went out to work, and then the sickness was gone. So you can see in the middle of her, while she is still sick, while she is relying on the Lord speaking to her, challenging her physical feelings, she writes a hymn that is in our hymnal, and we are familiar with. But actually, that book quoted the adapted version. Her poem that she wrote is called "The Will of the Lord Be Done." I have them both side by side here. This is the original. "No to the will of the devil. Yes to the will of the Lord." That's what she wrote in response to God's word that this sickness was an attack from Satan. So she just wrote up and said, "No." I really appreciate her strength in this. And then what we sing as a hymn is actually an adapted version that shows up very early. I think this adaptation is even from the 1930s, but done by Watchman Nee, presumably. "To the foe, my word is always no. To the Father, it is yes." So that we'll sing that briefly. We'll just sing 1 or 2 verses of that. What's interesting is that the meter is the same. So I have not tried it yet, but you can actually sing the original poem to the same tune. So I'm not sure if it's translated into Chinese and then back into English, that we have the sentences kind of flipped around. It does, it would be very different feeling of the poem if it was "No to the will of the devil, yes to the will of the Lord." I don't know. It's sharper, very much sharper sentiment. So the way we have it in the adaptation flows very nicely. I'll mute. Esther can play. If you can open up to your hymnal in 501 if you want, or we'll have the words on the right here. We'll sing. Okay, in our remaining 7 minutes, I have too many slides to go through. Luckily, we will cover the early years of Watchman Nee in the next class. So that will also overlap with a lot of things that we'll say with Emmy Barber. So I'm not going to focus on any of the Watchman Nee side, really, of the interaction, but I'll talk about other things and students that she encountered. With all her teaching and trials, she still maintained just like a very normal ministry of being a gospel preacher to people in their homes. One story was, she would come to people as they were cooking. They'd bring in the firewood to begin cooking. It's smart. They're sitting down probably for the next few hours. And in that, she would help them cook, converse, and take those few hours to share the gospel to them. But in all her trying to really be with the people, among them, live among them, she saw so many limitations. Both people probably were wary of her. Several unmarried, unaffiliated foreign women. It's very just kind of different, even for the missionaries that they were used to. What Emmy Barber was doing was very different. Maybe this was just, they had a lot of limitations in their ability to really reach out to the people. And even Agnes Kinnear writes this line, during Emmy Barber's first year in Fuzhou, Margaret Barber had witnessed the baptism of the second priest from the nearby Boiling Spring Hill Temple, once famous for its Buddha's tooth. So in her first year, she had seen such a strong attack on Buddhism in that area that even one of the second priests would become converted. Kinnear goes on, such things did not happen now. The winning of rural China for Christ seemed a far-off dream, unless they told themselves God himself chose to call young men and women from all over the land to the task. Yet why should he not do so? And they began to make this their constant prayer. And Emmy Barber and Miss Ballard would take afternoon hikes. And part of that would be to really pray that God would raise up indigenous leaders to really gain the countryside, gain the country for Christ. They did this faithfully for over 10 years, praying for a young crop of men and women to bring the gospel further into China. Eventually, this prayer began to be answered. Dora Yu, who was a famous preacher, came to Fuzhou in 1920 and ushered in a real revival. This is the revival that Watchman Nee and his mother and others became Christians in. And but as she departed Fuzhou from this 1920 time of preaching, she visited Emmy Barber. I don't know when they met or how they know of each other, but she visited Miss Barber on her way out of Fuzhou and was baptized by immersion. There it is again, rebaptism as a believer, causing all kinds of waves of controversy, but being huge in people's spiritual lives. So that began to, sorry. So Dora Yu went to Emmy Barber for baptism, and as she was leaving, either as she was leaving or as she was away, she had been doing some corresponding with Watchman Nee's mother, and she encouraged Watchman and his mother to go to Miss Barber for their baptism, even though they were, Watchman Nee was in the Methodist, already baptized as an infant, these kind of things. So Dora Yu encouraged this connection to Miss Barber. Around that time, another man named Leland Wang, he was a naval cadet of some sort. He had just gotten off the port at Pagoda, Anchorage, and he hears some hymn singing up the hill. And he was recently converted himself, maybe the year before, became a Christian. And so he met Emmy Barber independently. But Leland Wang's that's Leland Wang on the left there with Watchman Nee on the right. Leland Wang himself would go on to be a very famous gospel preacher. Leland Wang's younger brother, Wilson Wang, was a classmate of Watchman Nee. So they eventually met each other and began to form a circle that was passionate of preaching the gospel in their schools and in the city. And some of the first people that Watchman Nee got saved from his classmates were names like Simon Meek, Faithful Luke, and K.H. Way. And all of these became connected to Margaret Barber through Watchman Nee and Leland Wang. So you see a real kind of group forming, both out of like real conversion and then finding their shepherding and their nourishing from their teaching from Miss Barber. And these names are the real kind of legacy of her ministry. These are the leaders that God would continue to use in China for the next decades. This revival in 1920, it began to become so prominent that even the Anglican schools that she had used to work at were experiencing revival among their own students. Remember, actually, Watchman Nee went to St. Mark's Trinity College, which is the Anglican school that Emmy Barber's girls' school was like the other half of. So actually, the same missionaries that knew Emmy Barber from when she was a CMS missionary some of them are still involved in the school that Watchman Nee is going to. So this revival and controversy shows up in their records a little bit. But to show a little bit of the scope of just the revival among the high school students, Watchman Nee states that in 1950, so looking back on the whole thing, he says, there were 66 young people at Sister Barber's training. So this is maybe stating kind of like the height of how many people, it's not the revival, how many people actually would walk all the way to White Teeth Rock out of the city to go to a Bible class with Emmy Barber. Maybe 66 would come out to do that. And just another line he says, in the first letter I received from Brother D.M. Panton, he said that it would be considered good if after 10 years, 6 of those young people would still remain. So that's a really sobering view. On one level, there's so much happening in the gospel, but then D.M. Panton realizes to really serve the Lord in a serious way, it's really hard to gain that many for that. On the right here, this is a letter from the bishop, the Anglican bishop at the time in Fuzhou, and I've cut out a part of it. So he is asked from England that they have heard that there's some controversy with students being rebaptized. This is 1923. And he says, yes, we've had some trouble with cases of rebaptism. The mission at Pagoda, Anchorage consists of 3 ladies. One of them is our former fellow CMS missionary, Miss Barber. They have a few Chinese with them and are working very hard to preach their principles and doctrines among the Christians. They have always been a source of trouble to us, but they have become very much more aggressive lately. We gladly admit that there is much that looks like real spiritual revival in the present movement. And while we regret what is wrong, in their view, what is wrong in it, we would not try to check the zeal and ardor of the young men and women who are most affected by it. So it's just interesting to see what was going on with Watchman Nee and his students, his friends preaching the gospel gets so large that even back to England, they are hearing about it and the trouble that Emmy Barber is causing them. So by the end, that was 1923. She dies in 1930, but so near late in her life, there is this crop of solid ones among her. Even faithful Luke would go to serve full time with her at White Teeth Rock for about 7 years. So many actually young people began to be called into full-time ministry with her, because of her, trained by her. Actually, many sister ministers. There's names in the books. I'm sure they're not spelled right in the current Chinese pronunciation. Gi Songfan, Song Shi Gen, Li Rei Yu. 3 sister full-time ministers with her, as well as a faithful Luke. After he graduated, he didn't go to college, to the dismay of his family and teachers, but he went to White Teeth Rock to become just a gospel preacher full-time. And he stayed under her training until her death-ish around 1929, 1930. And she would hold, summer Bible conferences and trainings, not too different from what we do. There would be even 2 weeks long, 3 sessions a day. Participants were expected to, in the off times, review the notes, write poems, and do other assignments. So she actually viewed writing poems as a really good way to reflect on a sermon you had heard or a Bible study you had heard, and encourage them to kind of process what God was speaking to them by writing poems in their off time. I think that's really neat. You see that in her own life, that was something she did. In the work that she raised up, it was not just a few women at one building. They actually sent people out to raise up churches. These are Changtong and Lianxiang County. These are the regions around Fuzhou in the mountains, and they had a real kind of circuit that they itinerated around raising up churches, and they would send people out and then gather them together monthly for prayer times. These are my last slides. It's interesting. We have one letter where she wrote to D.M. Panton concerning Watchman Nee and faithful Luke and Leland Wang, and her kind of concern for them. This is 1926. So Watchman Nee, I forget, he's born 1903, so he's 23 at this time, if I have the dates right. So not a teenager, but still very much a zealous young man. She writes, "Please do not let faithful Luke and Watchman Nee worry you with letters. It is so good and kind of you to have written them once to them. They are likely to be tiresome. They write Mr. Wright Hay or any other editor they can address, whose address they can get, and do not understand how precious time is to a busy editor. For many reasons, I think you should not be feeling obliged ever to answer their letters. These two young men are in great danger. They have a mental apprehension of God's truth, which, unless lived out, will be their peril." That is insightful right there. They have a lot of truth. They're ardent for teaching, but she sees God's word is not for doctrine, it's to be lived out, and it becomes alive when it's experienced. So that is, you see what a good mentor she was, insightful mentor. She continues to more positive things in the letter. 3 sisters and 1 brother were baptized here this week by Leland Wang. We have precious bands of village men and women coming for teaching. Faithful is splendid with personal work, and this work amongst men and Miss Feck and Miss Ding are much used among the women. Satan hates this witness. I feel his rage at times, but Jesus is victor, and the Lord is a sun and shield. So I love just the kind of personal updates and how simple the details are to Dee and Panton. It shows they must have had many correspondences where he knows these people by name, and also she's updating him on kind of the daily life of what's going on for him to pass on and to pray. And you can just see that the saints back in Surrey Chapel would be praying for a faithful Luke and a Miss Ding for their continuation, knowing that out of the 66, maybe 6 could last 10 years later. Okay, our final slides. She passed away. These are pictures from her final days. And Emmy Barber, this is Miss Ballard. As she passed away, she began to compile some of her poems, not all that we have, but ones that she felt she wanted to publish, that they could be an encouragement to others. She published, so after her death, she didn't get to publish it in her lifetime. After her death, her niece, Miss Ballard, published this book, Verses of a Pilgrim. And the foreword tells us a few things. The writer of these song messages had, during the last few months of her life, a strong desire to send out some of the words of comfort the Lord had given her in booklet form in order to reach a wider circle of the Lord's own. He took her to himself before this desire could be realized, but they are now sent forth with the prayer that they may bring some cheer to fellow pilgrims traveling home to God. One thing I'll say about this, I love that these poems are characterized as song messages. And if you look at many of them, some of them are clearly not meant to be turned into a hymn. They're not maybe metered that way. They're to be read. But you can see that they're really an interaction of God's comfort to her, a message she needed in her life for that situation. And we've seen that in Via Bethlehem and To the Full My Word Always Know. They were a message to her need that day. And she wrote them down and sent them on that they could maybe continue to be a message, not just a hymn, not just something fun to sing, but a word of life for us in our situation. So we see in her struggle, she really lived out. I want nothing for myself. Very little was left when she passed away, but she wanted everything for the Lord. She passed away in 1930 after a brief battle, but probably quite a trial with Crohn's disease. Miss Ballard would stay and continue to work at White Teeth Rock until 1950, when all the foreigners had to leave China. That's our homework.
Well, that's the end of our section. You can learn more about a Sweet Savor Bible School on our website, link in the description. There you can find course descriptions and find out how you can join the next class. And for now, I'll say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. May Jesus bless you, and may we become a savor that is pleasing to our God.